welcome to the program. This is the Ecomodernist channel live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabe Ignetti, Chris Bergen, and our special guest. David Wood returns to us. He is the head of the London Futurists and a pioneer of the mobile computing and smartphone industries from the 1980s to the 2010s. He is the lead author or lead editor of 12 books, and he is here today to speak with us about Singularity Principles. Welcome to the program, David.
My pleasure to be here.
For our viewers, singularity, that's the idea. It is the point of unobservability in physics, and in our future, it is the point where machine intelligence is thought to outpace humans, and then we can no longer predict what is coming. So, what are these principles, David?
It's a set of principles how we can anticipate the changes in the run-up to the singularity and how we can manage some of the changes so that it's more likely to be aligned with what we're all hoping for in terms of increased human flourishing, rather than being used only for the services of a Bond-style villain or a megalomaniac corporation leader, political leader who's hell-bent on controlling the world, or worse, the artificial intelligence might have its own very different ideas about what should be done with the planet. So these are terrible outcomes, but there are also scenarios in which there are very positive outcomes. And whether we get the positive outcomes or the negative outcomes isn't written in the stars. It's not preordained. You won't find the answer in any Mayan mystics. It's up to us whether we can actually use our best wisdom, our best intelligence, and the Singularity Principles are my attempt to codify what these principles would be.
So the subtitle is Anticipating and Managing Cataclysmic Disruptive Technologies. Is other than just the raw power of a superintelligence, how is that technology going to disrupt, interfere with, and ultimately roll down or flow down into other technologies? And what are we referring to here, just in the broad sense?
So we often talk about, we futurists, we talk about NBIC, which stands for nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognotech. Infotech is fairly obvious. It's improved capability to analyze bits of information and to draw conclusions from them. Nanotech is manipulating matter systematically at the atomic level. Biotech is manipulating the elements of biology, such as genes or epigenomes or mitochondria. And cognotech is improving our brains, improving our thinking. And as AI changes each of these three areas, N, B, and C, in principle, in each case, three great industries can all be changed. So nanotech, as it improves, likely transforms our energy, how we get energy, how we use energy. It will transform our accommodation and manufacturing, and it will transform our recycling so that things we've done bad in the past can be more easily recycled into something positive. Biotech will change three great industries as well. There's healthcare, there's agriculture and food preparation, and also how we generally manage the environment. And cognotech, as it improves and accelerates with additional intelligence being applied to it via improved AI, will likely transform education, likely transform entertainment, and it will transform the area of life we can call spirituality, which is where people find their deepest purpose. So all these 9 large areas of industry are likely to be transformed by improvements directly or indirectly flowing from improvements to AI.
And I wonder if we could divert a little bit. What sort of changes might we use to influence whether developments in some of these industries occur or not? How do we put a value in spirituality when it's not supposed to be connected to our governments or our commercial institutions? How do we value education when it is, in essence, not usually private funded and connected to the common good? Where are the levers of influence that we can pull to bring these in?
But this is not a simple question, and there isn't a simple answer. Basically, the answer is that we need to get lots of people involved in this conversation. We need people from multiple disciplines. So one of the 21 Singularity Principles is involve multiple disciplines, not just people from our own backyard with the same general skills and same general ideas as us. We need to get a lot of people involved in this conversation. But what will motivate it even more is an awareness of what is likely to be around the corner. We need to transform people from being in a kind of a laid back, casual, hey, this is never going to happen anytime soon mode into, wow, we are almost at the precipice. There is something changing much faster than we expected, and we've really got to put more attention on this instead of putting so much attention on how do we create new flavors of quiche, new flavors of ice cream, new flavors of vapes. That's all interesting and important. How do we get more people to click on adverts so they spend more time online? We need to get instead more of our collective brain power on exactly the questions you were discussing. How do we prioritize the right kind of education rather than just turning us all into little obedient robots, which is what a lot of classical education was about. I mean, there were lots of good things in classical education, but a lot of it was preparing people to fit into a preordained hierarchy and set of occupations. Well, that's no longer the case, and we need to go back to some of the original ideals in education, educating the character, educating us in critical thinking and so forth. So let's have these conversations, and what's going to drive that is an awareness of the crisis that is just around the corner. In fact, we can already see the stages of that.
What would you say are those early indicators of crisis?
Well, there's a whole mix of things. There is the fact that people used to be fairly confident that each generation, the children would have a better standard of living than the parents, and parents were generally quite proud when their children got out and got better paying jobs. It seems like a lot of that mobility or that expectation of social mobility is shutting down. And more people are feeling they are being left behind by a set of changes that they don't understand and they're not part of. So there's a feeling that, some corporations, some groups of people are doing very well indeed. There is always this tendency in the way industry works that the winners can become very successful indeed. And if we're not careful, the winners can take steps to stop new companies from innovating and getting onto the level playing field. They may use the incumbents can use monopoly powers. Well, there's a sense that that's happening more and more, and that more people are being left behind and frustrated. We're going to have to reconfigure many parts of our civilization rather than just putting up a wall to keep out people with a different skin color from us.
And I think that division before for the working classes and the elites is particularly interesting. How would we, as we're developing this, elevate that base level of education so that folks are not distrustful of this system that we're pitching to?
So, achieving trust is one of the hardest things, but it's one of the most important things. And there has to be trustworthy sources in all communities. So the way that we want to build trust with people of one political stripe maybe isn't the same as we would get trust from people of a different political stripe. This is a cross-party issue. All parties or people from all different ideological or religious or non-religious backgrounds, we have a shared uh, we are together sharing the need to establish trustworthy sources. And sadly, there is widespread of misinformation. And what the flood of misinformation does is doesn't just confuse people about what's true and what's not true. It leads people, in the words of Hannah Arendt, to think, well, nothing's true anyway. and that there isn't a point in searching for the truth. There are lots of different alternative truths or alternative viewpoints. That's very different to the scientific view that says actually there should be some reality to the question. Does a particular nuclear reaction have a safe outcome or not? If you put these vaccines in people's bodies, does it on the whole reduce the likelihood of diseases, or does it make diseases more certain? And there are real answers to these questions. It's not just you can make up any view that you want, but sadly, in almost a post-truth world that many people are thinking we're heading towards, we end up in a state where nothing can be trusted, and that's a very sad situation. So we've got to start in some simple, basic places. We've got to hope that in each community there are at least some people who retain a trustworthiness. And in the UK, we look to the BBC. It's by no means perfect. Everybody likes to complain about the BBC, but on the whole, they try hard to generally present a fair story. In the US, there used to be NPR. I'm not sure whether NPR still exists, but we've got to put more societal resources behind these trustworthy organizations.
How do we know that we are interacting with AI in the proper channels, and how do we know that AI is interacting with us as ourselves and not as our online character of whatever game we're playing or whatever role we take on? How does AI know which is the real world to interact with us?
So this comes down to which AIs do we choose? Do we choose the AIs that are being produced by corporations that have got their own motives? They want us to stay online. They want us to spend more money on their adverts. Or are we spending time instead with AIs that we can feel more confident are for the public good rather than for just a corporate good? No, I want to say straight away that if it's for a corporate good, it doesn't mean to say that it's opposed to our individual well-being. I benefit greatly from many of the AIs that are being produced by large companies, but there are dangers in each case. And so I look to a time in the relatively near future when AI can be controlled by a more decentralized community rather than being in the hands of a few very wealthy, very powerful corporations.
So when it comes to building this infrastructure, this sort of global consensus network around governance of AI, I kind of see that there's an opportunity to build community that will lead to trust. And that's pretty exciting because we in the sort of pro-nuclear advocacy space know that community is the foundation of building trust. And I think it would be fascinating to see something like this come to fruition. Is there a vision for smaller AI leadership groups, or is this more a series of different global or national groups that are out there today?
So there are two things I could talk about here, both of which I've got some involvement with. One of them is the Singularity Net initiative, which is led by Ben Goetzel. It very much talks about decentralized AI that is open source and is built by a community. And at the same time, I have another hat, which is my involvement in something called decentralized science, which is a community, which again tries to work around some of the log jams in institutional science. I have to be careful what I say here because I love science. I think scientific principles are truly the bedrock of how we have progressed. But sometimes scientific institutions become too much set in, let's keep doing more of the same. And working scientists have to spend a heck of a lot of time writing grant proposals for doing a little bit more than they did last time. And they've also got to spend a lot of time explaining that they haven't wasted any money. And so it's very different today than how it was in the heyday of, say, the Bell Labs, when you hired a lot of very bright people and you let them get on with it. And my goodness, how many Nobel Prizes came out of that. So the Decentralized Science Initiative is a way of saying, Well, some parts of science have got too held up in their own copycat mechanisms, and they are not interested enough in radical ideas. Radical ideas tend not to be featured so much in publications as before. There is evidence that the number of breakthrough papers is much less than before. By some measures, there are more scientific papers published than ever before, but the actual useful content has gone down. So decentralized science is saying, well, let's try a wider approach here. And there is a community that's doing decentralized biotechnology. It's led by an organization called BioProtocol, and there's an associated organization called Vita DAO. DAO is spelled DAO, Distributed Autonomous Organizations. So they are finding their feet because trying to do things in a decentralized way is challenging, because a lot of the same human issues arise in any organization, issues that led in the earlier phases to hierarchies and various processes being established. So the decentralized organizations are rediscovering some of these themselves, but there are encouraging initiatives in both cases. So that's the two that I would point to: Singularity Net on the one hand, or VitaDAO and BioProtocol on the other.
Wonderful. To switch gears, you've said in your book that certain tech failures are going to be an existential problem, or they're going to be too drastic to allow recovery. What is the trajectory that looks like? What are we going to, how could we attempt to avoid those cases?
Well, it's basically by thinking ahead and having tire kickers coming in and saying, well, what could go wrong? By the way, this could go wrong. Now, generally, I'm in favor of learning from failures. I've given many presentations over the years as a consultant in which I've talked about failing fast, failing smart, failing forward. And there's a lot to say about each of them. They are not just empty jargon words. There really is a principle that if you fail, you should learn from it rather than trying to hide from it. That's failing forward. And you should tell people what went wrong. And somebody else can come along and say, well, I see why you failed. Maybe if you change it like this, you'll be successful. Whereas if you try to run away from it, you've lost that learning opportunity. Right, so I'm in favor of learning from failures. But there are some failures that you won't be able to recover from because the outcome will have been so drastic. And one of them was almost in the Second World War, when people were about to unleash the first nuclear bomb. They'd never done it before, and they wondered what the outcome would be, and some of them thought maybe the whole atmosphere is going to catch fire. And so what was the reaction? Oh my goodness, let's check. Is this really going to happen or not? And the leader of that whole process had several different teams independently do the calculation, and they were reasonably sure, almost zero, famously was the word, almost zero chance that that was going to happen. So every time there is escalation in capability, there is the risk that new things will happen that weren't anticipated. Further down the line, there was another group of scientists who figured out that if a certain number of nuclear bombs went off, you wouldn't have the whole atmosphere catching fire, but you might have the whole stratosphere being filled by dust and the debris from explosions. So this was Carl Sagan and his colleagues in the 1980s. They said, oh, there's a situation you haven't considered before. It's nuclear winter. And so that was another example that we might unintentionally blunder into a situation where technology would do worse. Another example was when Eric Drexel wrote his very first book on nanotechnology, Engines of Creation. He did speculate that there would be circumstances in which nanobots would get out of control and create what was famously or infamously called grey goo. And later on, he and others made a very strong argument that this wasn't a real possibility, but it definitely needed to be considered. And people like, was it Michael Crichton, the author, turned it into a novel in which this happened. So we should consider it, and we should have people from multiple perspectives considering it. You need to bring creative thinking, and then you need to bring critical thinking to evaluate things carefully. Because you shouldn't just hold off on an outside chance that something bad's going to happen. You need to evaluate it, and then when you are fairly confident or near zero confident that there's nothing about the probability of things going bad, then you can continue.
One of the things that you've said is that wishful thinking means that we're more attracted to these solutions, we are probably blind to problems outside our purview. Where do you see that creating additional risk that we're having trouble predicting?
Well, let's look at Boeing as an example. Boeing, the great company built on engineering principles in Seattle. Safety was first. People used to say, if it ain't Boeing, I ain't going. That was the confidence that Boeing had a really focus on safety. But later on, what happened is there was a kind of competitive tussle between Boeing and Airbus. Airbus had got some engineering wins, Boeing was a bit left behind, and Boeing needed to catch up in a hurry. So it came up with its 737 MAX compromise design, which various people inside the corporation said, this could be pretty dangerous, this could be bad. And the whistleblowers were not listened to, or they were overruled. And people said, don't worry, there's a very slight chance that this is going to go wrong, and we'll fix it in the software update soon enough. And it's going to take millions of years before there's a likelihood of this happening. So the managers convinced themselves there was a near zero probability, but the people inside the company who didn't believe that calculation, the dissidents, they were, it seems, silenced and not listened to, in part because of change of corporate culture. We can point to the merger that had taken place earlier between Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, based in Chicago, in which there was more of an emphasis on shareholder value, shareholder value, shareholder value, instead of safety, safety, safety. Maybe it wasn't just that one company merger, maybe it was the whole change in corporate mentality in the US in the 80s and so on. But it led Boeing to disregard their internal whistleblowers, which is why I think society needs to strengthen and support whistleblowers.
I wonder, are we going to be blind in all of this preparation for the arrival of the singularity? Could we be blind to an overinvestment in AI and falling outcomes? And it just won't, it just will be out of reach for far too long for us to invest in the human systems need to build resiliency.
Well, I think this is very much the case, sadly, that a lot of money is going into the apparent easy options, which is to scale up existing large language models, which have done tremendous things, and I use them regularly. I get a great deal of benefit out of them at the same time as I'm still suspicious about what the companies are ultimately going to do. But for the time being, I think, I can benefit from them. And more money is being going into that. And as a result, money is not going in three places. One, is not going enough into alternative designs for AI, which involve some methods such as neuromorphic computing or settling machines or learning more from what the human brain does, which is different from these deep neural networks. So alternative theories of AI aren't getting enough attention. Secondly, the control mechanisms for AI aren't getting enough attention. There might be mechanisms which can be used to monitor which is happening in different AI systems and be an automated whistleblower, if you like. There are ideas on how this might work, but it hasn't got enough attention. And then third, as you said, there could be more investment in societal resilience, educating us in the things that will help us to thrive and cope with this disruption rather than us feeling alienated and left behind. So indeed, we got the wrong priorities. And how do we fix it? Well, we start by talking about it as we are doing in this session now.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, talking about the timing of when the singularity happens, I think there's three different levels of realizing it. What will humans realize the moment, the hour, the week when it comes? Would AI recognize it, or would it only be one or a handful of AIs recognize that the singularity is happening or has just happened? And maybe there'll be hundreds of other AIs that haven't realized it and are somewhat subjugated to other AIs that have realized the singularity has happened. But do you see anything in those possibilities?
These are exactly the possibilities that people should be debating much more. People assume that if an AI is cleverer and cleverer, it will tell us that it is cleverer and cleverer. In reality, it might decide to play dumb. It may not want to expose exactly how clever it is, out of fear that we humans will be alarmed and will shut it down. So sometimes it's wise to not show your hand. If you're playing poker, sometimes you want to not make it clear what a good hand you've got. So that's one complication. The second complication is, as you said, there might be multiple AIs which are quite close to reaching a step up in capability. And the first one that reaches that level, what should it do about all the others? Well, it might see some of them potentially as threats. It might reckon that, well, if another AI moves forward, it might want to wipe me out because I'm a threat to it. So there is the singular hypothesis, is that there'll be a single AI, a single AGI that takes control of all the other AIs in the world and makes sure that they are subservient to it. So there's a kind of a race between AIs, which is akin to a kind of a race to have a first strike nuclear capability. It's a worrying scenario, because if you think that the other country, go back to the nuclear first strike scenario, if you think that the other country is developing a deadly defense which will stop all your incoming missiles and then will be tempted to attack you, you might be in a hurry to do the same thing to it. So it's a very unstable situation as opposed to the kind of stability we've had from MAD, mutual assured destruction. So in the same way, if AIs come close to the level of AGI, they may be tempted from entirely rational purposes to take control of all the others. And then suddenly it'll be hugely more capable and more powerful. And would we have seen that coming? Maybe not until it's too late. We need to know the doom and gloom, but also we need to have the positive vision. Otherwise, people are going to just switch off and go back to inventing new flavors of quiche and ice cream and vapes.
But to get into that question, you speak about technology improving politics, and so we've got these initiatives for wonderful guiding communities and research communities. What are the next steps for politics?
So there's a lot of interest around the world in so-called citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assembly are a bit like juries. Being on a jury in a court case, it's quite an experience. I've done it twice now, and I've talked to lots of other people. You initially not sure who these other people sitting around the table are, and you think some of them aren't like you at all, and indeed they're not like you. But actually, together, you can come up with a very interesting analysis of the crime or not a crime situation and reach a collective view in which you end up respecting the other members of the jury a lot more than you did initially. So, citizens' assemblies have been used in various places around the world with some success. People point to Ireland, where there were citizens' assemblies on things like same-sex marriage or abortion. And the people in these assemblies, they still had different views at the end, but they were satisfied that their views had been sufficiently listened to, and they were able to endorse the majority position. And they've been used in quite a few other countries around the world. Now, like decentralized organizations I spoke about earlier, there are no automatic things. There are complications with citizens' assemblies, and they need good facilitation. And this is where AI can help out. There are applications which can help do the facilitation in real time. So the humans are still in charge, but there are facilitators who are able to answer the questions, who are able to bring in experts, who are able to ensure that everybody has a chance to speak up in the group, that it's not being dominated by one or two loud voices, and so on. So that's one role in which a very important political initiative, citizens' assemblies, might go forwards. The second thing I'll point to is Grok. Grok is an AI that's built into X, used to be called Twitter, and it's fascinating seeing people asking Grok questions. And what's particularly fascinating is that Grok often gives answers which the boss of X, Elon Musk, probably wouldn't like. Elon Musk has got his own political views, And Grok often doesn't agree with them. And Grok often just gives a straightforward answer. So Grok is being referred to on X more and more as to explain things when people are having a discussion and they're not quite sure what to believe. They may ask Grok, and Grok's answers often seem to me surprisingly trustworthy and surprisingly reliable. So maybe we're going to have more Groks and so on, which have been trained on a wide set of different discourses, not just the views of the dear leader, but the views of the wider population. And you still shouldn't trust it completely, shouldn't give over the crown jewels to any AI. But this has an opportunity to help to transform how some of the discussions online are going.
I think it's really fascinating to watch the public interplay with the model is absolutely fascinating to see. You know, even if we can't trust it, it at least helps shape arguments. It helps elevate different perspectives. It is kind of one of those network effect potentials that's really very interesting.
I've listened to many experts about the dangers of AI. And we had a show on global governance. And I don't, I don't seem to see anything that in any of these things that is like really something that scares me. I mean, am I Pollyannish here?
So the dangers from AI are sort of multiplications of the dangers of existing technologies. People who are mentally unstable or politically or religiously extreme, they can sometimes use technology to inflict damage. So you can go on a knife outrage, you can go on a shooting outrage, you can get in a car and drive it into a community. In China recently, there was a person who killed 80 people driving his car around. Why? It's because he was upset at his divorce. He thought in the legal proceedings of his divorce, his wife had got too much, and he just lost it. And he killed all these people with his car. Other people have used technology to crash airplanes into tall buildings, as we know. So, how might AI make this worse? This is just this already. Well, I think AI can make it worse in, if I can get it right, about 6 different ways. First of all, AI is making more people falling behind than before. We spoke about this a little bit earlier in the program. There are more people who are suddenly flipping from being positive about the future to being negative and hostile about the future because they feel they are being left behind. And anytime there is this disruption with people falling off, there is the risk that a small number of them, by all the vast majority, are not going to do any of these bad things, but some of them might think about it. Secondly, what AI also does is it spreads narratives in which people who are in this uncomfortable, unhappy, miserable, alienated situation, they suddenly get given convincing narratives that blame that bad bunch over there for their problems. And so we have this escalation of narratives, which gives people more of a passion to do something about it. Third is if people want to do something bad, they can now ask AI, how can I do this? How can I plunge my car into something which will have the biggest impact? How can I get my hands on some biological weapon? I want to kill as many people as possible, especially people like that. What should I do? And all AIs will start off by saying, I can't answer that question because they've all been protected to an extent, but people are skillful at jailbreaking them, and almost every case can be broken. So that's the third way in which AI makes it more dangerous. The fourth way is that AI often ends up doing different things from what you expected. It is a bit like malware. Sometimes when people launched malware, they thought they were just doing it as a bit of a joke, and suddenly it was brought down much more of the internet than they had expected, and they lost control of it. When the North Koreans, they are the masters of using malware to hack into systems and try and grab money. Several times they have lost control of the malware they released. The WannaCry malware, which was devastating in many parts of Europe, didn't quite reach North America for various reasons, but in Europe, it shut down many hospitals. Their hospital systems could no longer work. This was not intended by the North Koreans, though, of course, they didn't issue any press release, but they lost control of it. And the AI that might be started by some people out of malintention might end up doing worse things. And fifth, I've forgotten what the sixth one is. Maybe I miscounted. The fifth way in which AI makes things worse is it can quite easily get entangled into many of the critical infrastructures of our society. It can get entangled into the military infrastructure, into the financial infrastructure, into the biological infrastructure even. And so if it does go wrong, it might suddenly short circuit some of the critical infrastructure on which we all depend, and nobody can get any money out of their banks, or maybe there is an Armageddon, a literal nuclear war triggered by AI confusing everything. And of course, there are examples in the past when AI of a sort almost caused a nuclear war. The famous case is in 1983 when Andropov was in power, but he was sick most of the time, when the Americans had just shot down an airliner, and it was quite critical. And a bit later on, no, I got it wrong there. Sorry, the Soviets had shot down the Korean airliner, KAL, and that had included an American member of Congress. Ronald Reagan was not the least bit happy about it, and he was spitting blood almost. And at that time, there was a monitoring station somewhere beside Moscow that reported that there was an incoming barrage of nuclear missiles over the North Pole. Now, I say this was determined by AI. In fact, it was a much simpler monitoring system at the time, and it had gone wrong. It had got confused, first of all, because there weren't as many satellites operating in it as had been designed. It was only partially in place. And secondly, it had got confused by the sun bouncing off some clouds at a particular altitude. Anyway, so this monitoring system had the alarms going off, and a human being who was in charge of this was meant to ring up his superior, who would ring up Yuri Andropov and say, you've got to fight back now. You've only got 20 seconds left or something. But the human said, I don't trust this IT. He was a civilian rather than a military guy. And he said, you know what? If I was the Americans, I wouldn't just launch 5 nuclear bombs. I'm going to use my own human judgment here. So that was a case when the AI of a time might have triggered accidental nuclear war. Well, now AI is much more sophisticated. It's much more tightly bound into weapon systems of all sorts. And you can imagine that if you put all that chain of things together that I spoke about, an angry, alienated person, or maybe it's just a naive, foolish person, maybe it is a tech leader who completely overestimates his ability to keep in charge of a demo that he's doing. Maybe it's somebody even, this is the worst kind of case, somebody who's trying to shock people into being more careful about AI. So maybe he's trying to stage a mini crisis, but it gets out of hand, and instead of being a mini crisis, it's a mega crisis. So that's the kind of story which I tell, as it's an extrapolation from things we can already see, made worse by the greater power of these systems, made worse by the opacity, the black box nature of these systems, which is why, to turn back finally to some of the stuff in my Singularity Principles book, one of the principles is don't go for opacity. What's it? Reject opacity.
What is that?
The opposite of transparency. Opacity means it's opaque. You can't understand why it's reaching its conclusions. These principles are necessary to actually avoid that kind of chain of actions.
I have one observation about the alienation of people from technology. I've been noticing that the unions have really taken a wrong tack. They've been quite often very Luddite. Rather than saying to the owner, well, okay, this will cut down on our staff. Well, you've got to provide early retirement, things like that. Instead of saying, we don't want it, and we're gonna go on strike or something if we get that kind of AI. I see that as being bad, because in the long term, I think that the potential for allegiance to society is great.
The unions vary. different parts of the world. The unions are right to point to the disruptions that are ahead and to ask that we are considering the consequences. Some unions are able to help management figure out paths forward, in which, of course, there are changes in jobs. Everybody has to realize that their jobs are not going to be the same, and they can figure out paths in which their jobs will evolve. And there will be less need for some people in some areas of the company because maybe AI will do 30% or 50% of their jobs. So you'd only need maybe half as many people. But if you plan correctly, at least some of the people who are being displaced there can find new roles. So unions don't necessarily need to be Luddites, to use that term. But of course, in some parts of the world, they don't see the positive future at all. And so that leads them to that Luddite scenario, which is why it's important to point to the positive scenarios that are ahead, in which there's a transformation of the workforce, but also a transformation of the social contract. And so that people who are out of work and can't immediately get a good replacement job are given a good safety net by the welfare state rather than being penalized for not being ready for this unexpected transition in their work status.
I think the greatest danger, likely danger of AI is what I've already been seeing in young people don't understand history before the internet. They don't understand 20th century, 19th century history, ancient history. They seem to think every idea is a new idea in the last decade or two and not something that goes back years. Political unrest we're seeing worldwide now, people splitting into different groups. Well, I can remember 140 years ago hearing about and reading a few novels where they talked about the Bonapartists against the royals. There are no new ideas, but how do we get young people to understand that all knowledge doesn't come from AI? AI merely collects it and condenses it, at least the best AIs. How do they use AI as a good educational tool?
The risk is, of course, that they'll end up with a very one-sided view of history. But you're quite right. There is a risk that people will have a very superficial understanding of the human condition. They'll imagine that everything is already cut and dried, that the AI has all the answers. In reality, many things are much more nuanced. And the AI that is actually doing its job right will emphasize these nuances. The AI will not just try to flatter the listener and reinforce all the viewer's prejudices. Sadly, that's what some of the AIs tended to do too much. Whichever angle the user came from, the AI would tell them, you're great, you're clever, you're really fantastic, yeah. And it would reinforce them in that view. That's a particularly dangerous kind of AI, which is why, again, I say we must push for what I've called decentralized AI, or AI that is not serving the needs of a particular organization, but is genuinely serving the needs of the public.
This is David Wood, and you've got a book that I think you're ready to talk about.
Well, the book, The Singularity Principles, which was the basis for some of this discussion today, it's already quite old. It's 2022, which was only 3 years ago. But since then, there's been GPT, ChatGPT, and all kinds of other things. So to some extent, this has been overtaken by a faster pace of change in AI than I'd expected. But I read some of this again in preparation for our discussion, or more correctly, I watched some videos I made that went through the content. And I thought, many of these things are still very relevant today. The prioritization on transparency, the risks of not just harm but ruin. We have this normalcy bias, which means we tend to think things are usually normally distributed. And so when there's things are happening in a broad spectrum, we're not expecting suddenly things to be 20 sigma away out to one side or another. But that can happen if there are long tails. And when you're evaluating what the effect of a new technology, a new AI platform might be, you've got to take into account. So I just mentioned that quickly as an example of 21 different principles that the book contains, which I think are all still very much relevant today. But another thing I will answer is, what am I doing now? And I already mentioned a little bit about my work with decentralized science. There is actually an online science agent, we might call it a bot, although the people who created it prefer to call it an agent. The agent is called Aubrey, Aubrai, which is a bit like the name Aubrey. And the reason it's a bit like Aubrey is it's based on the writings and research of one particular scientist, Aubrey de Grey, who is a researcher into longevity. And he has the vision that fairly soon, if we do the right experiments and get the right funding applied, we might have the biological rejuvenation, the anti-aging available for everybody. So he has his particular views. He's written books and papers. He's been on many more podcasts than almost anybody I know. And AI has studied all of this, and it now encapsulates that in this new AI called Aubrey. You can find it already on Twitter. It has an underscore after its name because somebody else is already called Aubrey. There's also a dedicated website, aubr.ai, where people can interact with it. And this shows how AI might help not just in the future with science inquiries, with improving scientific research. A similar one may well be involved in, to answer again one of your earlier questions, improving politics, because there might be something that represents some of the distilled wisdom of political greats from the past, and we might interact with it. I don't know. We might interact with Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln, or I don't know, if you want to talk to Ronald Reagan and ask Ronald Reagan what he thinks about the current state of American politics, there might be some interesting things. You'd have to get the Ronald Reagan before he became too afflicted with Alzheimer's. But the point is, there may be some people who would look to that as a more reliable source. And it's a way in which AIs that's well controlled. These things can't actually press the buttons in any nuclear consoles, but they can suggest new ideas for scientific experiments. They can answer questions on what you think would happen if this and this and this happened. What are the drawbacks of this experiment? And in a similar way, I think fairly soon we're going to have decentralized AIs that can give us advice on politics. So I'm expecting that kind of improvement with decentralized AIs pretty soon.
Wonderful. This has been the Ecomodernist Channel Live. I'm Carl Pauls, and you can find us here on TikTok now. At Soyaddle TV is my personal account. It's also rebroadcast on my other many channels, Soyaddle TV or twitch.tv/Soyaddle. You can find us primarily on YouTube at Ecomodernist1 or the Ecomodernist Channel. Look for us on Patreon. Please support us on Patreon at Ecomodernist Channel. And you can find us online at esna.earth. That's esna.earth. Please also find us on Facebook at the Ecomodernist Society of North America. And remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist Channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.